You ever look at your neighbors and wonder what their real story is? That nice couple down the street with the perfectly manicured lawn, the kids playing basketball in the driveway, the minivan in the garage with the faded bumper stickers. They wave at you every morning when you're getting the newspaper, they show up to neighborhood association meetings, they complain about the HOA fees just like everyone else. Their kids go to the same school as yours. You've been to their barbecues. You've borrowed their lawnmower. But what if I told you that somewhere in America right now, at this very moment, there's a family just like that living 3 houses down from someone just like you, except the parents aren't who they say they are. They weren't born with the names on their driver's licenses. Their entire existence, every single detail of their suburban American life, is a performance that was rehearsed in a compound on the other side of the world. Their accents, their mannerisms, their work history, even their marriage, all of it was constructed by an intelligence service before they ever set foot on American soil. And here's the part that should make your skin crawl. Their own children, the kids you see getting on the school bus every morning, have absolutely no idea they're living inside an active intelligence operation. Imagine growing up thinking you're as American as apple pie and football, going to prom, stressing about college applications, fighting with your parents about curfew, only to have FBI agents knock on your door one morning and inform you that your parents are foreign spies and literally everything you've ever believed about your family is carefully constructed fiction. Your grandparents aren't real. Your family vacations were operational cover. Your childhood home was a safe house. That's not the plot of a streaming series. That's exactly what happened to 2 kids in Phoenix, Arizona, and the story of how the KGB pulled off one of the longest-running deep-cover operations on American soil will fundamentally change how you think about the invisible war that's still being fought in suburbs and strip malls across this country. This is the world of illegals, the ghosts who live among us with manufactured pasts and patient missions, and by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly how a human being can be transformed into someone else so completely that even their own children never suspect the truth. Phoenix, Arizona, March 1998. A modest 3-bedroom ranch house in a subdivision that could exist in any Sunbelt city in America. Gravel front yard with some struggling desert landscaping. Garage door that squeaks when it opens. Kitchen with outdated appliances and a calendar from the local insurance company hanging on the wall. Inside this utterly unremarkable house, a couple in their early 40s is helping their 2 teenage children with homework at the dining room table. The father, who everyone in the neighborhood knows as Michael Robert Johnson, works as an independent software consultant. The kind of guy who has business cards but whose actual job description is vague enough that nobody asks too many follow-up questions. The mother, Sarah Ann Johnson, teaches part-time at a community college, mostly remedial English courses and the occasional literature seminar. They've lived in this house since 1992, and in the Phoenix metro area since 1985. They drive a Ford Taurus and a Toyota Camry. They have a golden retriever named Buddy. They attend parent-teacher conferences where they ask concerned questions about grade point averages and SAT prep courses. They've hosted 4th of July barbecues where they served hamburgers and hot dogs and made small talk about property values and school district boundaries. Their daughter Jennifer is 17, a senior in high school who plays volleyball and wants to study psychology. Their son David is 15, obsessed with computers and already talking about applying to engineering programs. To every single person who knows them, the neighbors who've watched their kids grow up, the teachers who've had both children in class, the other parents they've sat next to at countless school events, the Johnsons are the absolute definition of ordinary middle-class American family life. Boring, even. The kind of people you forget about 5 minutes after the conversation ends. But 3 times a week, long after Jennifer and David have gone to bed, after the lights in the neighboring houses have gone dark, Sarah walks to a park 6 blocks away with a small shortwave radio receiver carefully hidden in a canvas bag. She sits on a bench near the playground equipment, pretends to read a book under the streetlight, and listens to seemingly random sequences of numbers transmitted on a specific frequency. Michael, on different nights, drives to a strip mall parking lot near a 24-hour grocery store and sits in his Taurus reading a newspaper, waiting for a specific vehicle to park exactly 3 spaces away, waiting for a stranger to walk past his car and drop a folded newspaper into the trash he can retrieve 3 minutes later. They are not Michael and Sarah Johnson. Those people do not exist and never did. They are Directorate S operatives of the first Chief Directorate of the Committee for State Security, deep-cover Soviet intelligence officers who entered the United States in 1971 with carefully forged Canadian passports, completely fabricated biographical backgrounds, and a mission directive that would ultimately span nearly 3 decades of their lives. And their children, Jennifer and David, born in American hospitals, raised speaking only English, pledging allegiance to the flag every single morning in their public school classrooms, celebrating Thanksgiving and Christmas and the 4th of July, have absolutely no idea that their parents are KGB agents or that their entire childhood has been taking place inside an active espionage operation. The man the world would eventually come to know as Michael Robert Johnson was born Mikhail Dmitrievich Vasiliev in Volgograd in August 1956, in a small apartment in a concrete housing block that looked identical to 10,000 other housing blocks across the Soviet Union. His father worked as a mid-level bureaucrat in the regional Communist Party apparatus, the kind of position that came with minor privileges like slightly better housing assignments and occasional access to goods that weren't available in regular stores. His mother was a school teacher who had studied English literature at university, a rarity in provincial Soviet cities during that era, and who spoke the language with impressive fluency despite having never traveled outside the Soviet bloc. Mikhail was the youngest of 3 children, a quiet boy who showed early aptitude for languages and mathematics, the kind of student who absorbed information effortlessly and could mimic accents and speech patterns with unsettling precision. He learned English from his mother starting at age 6, and by his early teens he was reading American novels and listening to bootleg recordings of American radio broadcasts that circulated among certain circles. He was also, though he didn't know it yet, exactly the type of candidate Soviet intelligence recruiters were always watching for. At 18, in the summer of 1974, while his former classmates were being drafted into mandatory military service in the Red Army, Mikhail received a different kind of summons. A letter with no return address and minimal information instructed him to report to an office building in Moscow on a specific date, to a room number on the 7th floor of a structure that had no nameplate on the door and no indication of what government function it served. This was the height of the Cold War, the Brezhnev era, when the KGB's Directorate S was significantly expanding its illegal program, the network of deep cover operatives who would live abroad under completely false identities with no official connection whatsoever to Soviet embassies or consulates or any traceable link to the Soviet state. These weren't diplomats with immunity who could be expelled if caught. They were ghosts. If they were arrested, Moscow would deny their existence entirely. Mikhail spent the next 4 years, from 1974 to 1978, at a facility that officially didn't exist, a training complex known among its students as the Red Banner Institute, located outside Moscow in a restricted area that required special passes to enter. There, he learned to become someone else entirely. He studied American history in exhaustive detail, memorizing not just major events but regional variations in how those events were taught and remembered. He learned the geography of cities he'd never visited, could describe neighborhoods and landmarks as if he'd grown up there. He studied consumer culture, brand names, popular television shows, sports statistics, the kind of cultural knowledge that can't be faked without deep immersion. He learned to think in English, to dream in English, to stop translating in his head and simply exist in the language. He practiced American mannerisms, studied how Americans stood and gestured and expressed emotion, watched hours of film footage to absorb body language that was distinctly not Soviet. He memorized a fictional childhood in Vancouver, complete with street addresses, school names, friends' names, family anecdotes, a backstory so detailed and rehearsed that it became more real to him than his actual childhood in Volgograd. The woman who would become his operational partner and eventually his wife, born Svetlana Ivanovna Kozlov in Leningrad in 1958, underwent identical preparation in a parallel program. She had been recruited at 19, a linguistic student with a gift for mimicry and a personality that instructors described as adaptable and controlled. Mikhail and Svetlana met for the first time in 1977 during an advanced training exercise where they were assigned to pose as a married couple for 6 months in an extraordinary facility that existed somewhere in the Soviet Union, an entire simulated American town where everyone spoke only English, used American currency, followed American customs, and where any slip into Russian or Soviet behavior resulted in immediate disciplinary consequences. They lived in a house with American furniture and American appliances. They shopped in a store stocked with American products. They read American newspapers that were flown in weekly. They attended social gatherings where they practiced small talk about weather and television shows and local politics. By the time they boarded a flight from Frankfurt to Montreal in March 1971, carrying Canadian passports that identified them as Michael Robert Johnson and Sarah and Mitchell, Mikhail Vasiliev and Svetlana Kozlov had effectively ceased to exist. They had been replaced by people who had never been born. The operation had a code name that appeared in fewer than a dozen documents in all of Moscow Center, known only to the highest-ranking officers in Directorate S and personally approved by the chairman of the KGB, Operation Sagebrush. The authorization came directly from Yuri Andropov during his tenure leading the Committee for State Security, part of a broader strategic initiative to position long-term intelligence gathering assets in American regions that were experiencing rapid growth in technology and defense sectors. The southwestern United States in the 1970s and 1980s was seeing explosive expansion in aerospace engineering, computing, telecommunications, defense contracting, all the industries that would define late 20th century military and economic competition. Unlike traditional espionage that relied on recruitment of compromised officials or penetration of government agencies, illegals like Michael and Sarah were designed to integrate so completely into American society that they would become functionally invisible, living normal lives in normal communities while slowly, patiently positioning themselves to access information through entirely ordinary civilian channels. The first phase of the operation consumed 3 full years. Michael and Sarah lived in Toronto from 1971 to 1974, establishing their Canadian identities through legitimate employment, tax records, rental agreements, bank accounts, social connections, building a verifiable documentary history that would withstand background checks and routine investigations. Michael worked as a junior programmer at a small technology company that was just beginning to explore applications for early microprocessors. Sarah enrolled in courses at a local college and worked part-time as an administrative assistant. They were building a paper trail, creating a reality that could be verified by anyone who cared to look. They made friends, attended social gatherings, participated in the mundane routines of young professionals in a major Canadian city. They learned to be boring. In 1974, they crossed into the United States at the Buffalo border checkpoint on their Canadian passports, telling the immigration officer they were relocating for Michael's job opportunity in California. They settled initially in San Jose, in the heart of what was just beginning to be called Silicon Valley, where Michael found work as a programmer at a mid-sized company that made circuit boards for various electronics manufacturers. Sarah took a position teaching English as a second language at a community education center. They rented a 1-bedroom apartment, bought used furniture, adopted a cat. They were 24 years old, highly trained intelligence officers living as ordinary immigrants pursuing modest versions of the American dream. In 1976, Sarah became pregnant. This was not accidental. Moscow Center had determined that a couple with children would integrate more naturally into suburban communities, would have access to schools and youth sports leagues and parent social networks where information moved freely and guardrails were lower. In June 1976, Jennifer Elizabeth Johnson was born at a hospital in San Jose, a United States citizen by birth under the 14th Amendment. 2 years later, David Michael Johnson entered the world under the same circumstances. The children were not part of the operation in any official capacity according to the mission parameters. They were not agents. They were not assets. They were cover, but they were also real, fully documented American citizens with social security numbers and birth certificates and pediatric medical records. Michael and Sarah raised them as Americans because legally and practically, that's exactly what they were. What Moscow Center had calculated, correctly, was that a couple with young children would attract significantly less suspicion from neighbors and authorities, would appear more rooted and stable, would have legitimate reasons to be involved in community institutions. What the planners perhaps didn't fully anticipate, or chose not to consider too deeply, was how the presence of these children would fundamentally complicate the psychological reality of the long-term assignment for the operatives themselves. By 1985, the Johnson family had relocated to Phoenix. Michael had transitioned into independent consulting work, a career structure that gave him flexibility to travel, to take contracts with various companies, to move through different professional networks without attracting the kind of scrutiny that comes with traditional employment. Sarah had obtained her teaching credentials and found part-time work at a community college, where she taught basic English composition and occasionally literature survey courses, a position that put her in regular contact with students and faculty who had connections to the defense contractors and research facilities that dotted the Phoenix metropolitan area and the broader Arizona corridor. Their tradecraft was meticulous but deliberately low-key, designed to be sustainable over many years without creating patterns that counterintelligence analysts might eventually detect. Communications with Moscow Center happened primarily through shortwave radio, encrypted number stations that broadcast seemingly random sequences that could only be decoded with one-time pads. Sarah would sit in the park with her receiver, writing down numbers in a small notebook, later using the pad to convert them into actual operational instructions. The system was extraordinarily old-fashioned even by 1980s standards, essentially unchanged from World War II-era methods, but that was precisely why it remained effective. It generated no electronic trail, required no suspicious equipment beyond a radio that thousands of hobbyists owned, and was nearly impossible to intercept in any useful way without knowing exactly when and where to listen. Dead drops happened in public parks, messages hidden in hollowed-out rocks or fake dog waste or commercial products left in predetermined locations. Meetings with handlers or other operatives used parking lots, brief encounters disguised as chance meetings between strangers, a folded newspaper exchanged, a package left in a shopping cart. They never discussed anything operational in their house, operating on the assumption that at any moment they could be under technical surveillance. They never used telephones for anything beyond completely mundane conversation. They never wrote anything down except in code using the one-time pads that were destroyed immediately after use. Everything operational happened in the narrow windows of time when Jennifer and David were at school or asleep or otherwise occupied. The children grew up thinking their parents were exactly who they appeared to be, hard-working immigrants from Canada who had built a comfortable middle-class existence in the American Southwest. There were Thanksgiving dinners with neighbors where Sarah made traditional dishes she'd learned from cookbooks. There were little league games where Michael coached David's team and kept statistics in a scorebook. There were family vacations to the Grand Canyon and Disneyland, camping trips in the mountains, birthday parties with classmates, dance recitals, science fairs, all the textbook experiences of American childhood in the suburbs. The cognitive dissonance that Michael and Sarah existed within was psychologically profound in ways their training had prepared them for intellectually but not emotionally. They had been trained to view the United States as the primary adversary of the Soviet Union, the capitalist empire whose global reach and military power posed an existential threat to the socialist world. Yet they were watching their children absorb American cultural values, develop thoroughly American identities, dream American dreams about college and careers and futures that had nothing to do with the Soviet Union. They attended PTA meetings where they smiled and nodded and discussed school funding and curriculum standards while mentally cataloging which parents worked for which companies and which companies were doing what kind of work. They coached youth soccer teams and collected intelligence. They helped with algebra homework and encoded messages to Moscow. They lived double lives so completely bifurcated that the seam between them became almost impossible to locate. The operation's success depended on this performance being absolutely seamless, without cracks or inconsistencies, and for 27 years it was exactly that. The intelligence that Michael and Sarah gathered and transmitted was not the dramatic material of spy thrillers. There were no stolen nuclear weapons designs, no photographed classified documents smuggled out of secure facilities, no recruited traitors passing state secrets in shadowy parking garages. What they collected was something simultaneously less dramatic and more valuable, harder to defend against and nearly impossible to prosecute: systematic access to the ambient technological and industrial landscape of the American Southwest during a period of extraordinary innovation and expansion. Through Sarah's position at the community college, she developed professional and social relationships with graduate students who were working on research projects with defense applications, with adjunct professors who held day jobs at companies like Hughes Aircraft and Honeywell and various smaller contractors that supported the larger defense industrial base. Conversations at faculty social events, coffee breaks between classes, casual discussions about frustrations with funding or excitement about new projects, complaints about management decisions or observations about which departments were hiring and which were conducting layoffs. Sarah never asked pointed questions. She listened. She absorbed. She remembered. Michael's consulting work took him into mid-sized technology companies throughout the region, putting him in contact with engineers and project managers and business development people who talked freely about industry trends and competitive landscapes and which companies were winning contracts and which were struggling. In the culture of American business, especially in the relatively informal environment of 1980s and 1990s tech companies, people talked about their work constantly. They complained about deadlines. They bragged about breakthroughs. They gossiped about office politics and strategic direction. Nobody thought twice about discussing these things with a consultant who was helping with a software project or a business analyst who was sitting in on planning meetings. Over years and years, this ambient information, none of it individually classified or even particularly sensitive, coalesced into an extraordinarily detailed and current picture of American technological capabilities, research priorities, industrial vulnerabilities, strategic directions in the sectors that mattered most for long-term military and economic competition. Moscow Center received regular reports, transmitted through the shortwave system or occasionally through personal meetings with handlers who would travel to Phoenix posing as business contacts or old friends from Canada. The reports detailed which technology sectors were seeing increased investment, which research projects were being abandoned or redirected, where there were supply chain dependencies or single points of failure, what the general sentiment was about future directions in aerospace and computing and telecommunications. It was mosaic intelligence, each individual piece meaningless in isolation, but collectively forming a comprehensive picture that would be extraordinarily difficult and expensive to obtain through traditional intelligence methods. Michael and Sarah also served another crucial function within the broader illegal network. They were a relay node. Other deep cover operatives, living in different cities under different identities, would occasionally make contact according to predetermined schedules, passing information that Michael and Sarah would then transmit to Moscow through their established communication channels. They were infrastructure, invisible and patient, exactly what Directorate S had designed them to be. The beginning of the end for Operation Sagebrush came not from American counterintelligence operations or security breaches, but from the geopolitical earthquake that nobody in Moscow Center had planned for when they authorized the mission in 1971. In August 1991, hardliners attempted a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. The coup failed. Within months, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. The KGB was dissolved and reorganized into multiple successor agencies. Directorate S found itself under the umbrella of the newly formed Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation, facing massive budget cuts, bureaucratic chaos, and fundamental questions about mission priorities in a world where the ideological framework that had justified the entire illegal program had collapsed overnight. Communications with deep cover operatives became sporadic and sometimes contradictory. Some illegals were recalled to Moscow, their missions terminated, their false identities abandoned. Others received instructions to maintain their positions but with revised objectives that often made little sense in the new geopolitical environment. Some were simply abandoned, cut loose without support or direction, left to navigate the collapse of the system that had created them. For Michael and Sarah, now in their early 40s with teenage children and nearly 20 years invested in their false identities, the situation became increasingly surreal. They continued their cover lives because there was no realistic alternative, but the purpose that had structured their entire adult existence had evaporated. They still performed dead drops and listened to shortwave broadcasts, but the messages were infrequent, sometimes months apart, and when they came they were often vague or contradictory. The Russian Federation's intelligence priorities were in flux. Funding was unreliable. The bureaucratic structures that had managed the illegal program were being reorganized or eliminated. By the mid-1990s, Michael and Sarah were essentially orphaned operatives, too deeply embedded in their false identities to extract themselves easily or safely, yet no longer serving any coherent strategic mission. The psychological strain of this liminal state was immense. Jennifer was preparing for college applications, worried about SAT scores and scholarship opportunities. David was winning regional science competitions and talking about wanting to study computer engineering at MIT or Stanford. Both children were thoroughly, completely American, with no knowledge of or connection to Russia, no ability to speak Russian, no framework for understanding what their parents actually were. Michael and Sarah faced questions that had never been part of their training. What happens when the mission outlives the state that authorized it? What do you do when your cover life has become more real than the identity you were born with? How do you reconcile spending your children's entire lives lying to them, using them as unwitting props in an intelligence operation they never consented to be part of? The operational collapse came in 1998, triggered not by any dramatic investigative breakthrough but by routine bureaucratic process intersecting with technological advancement in record-keeping systems. Michael applied for a security clearance as part of a consulting contract with a company that was doing work for the Department of Defense, a mid-level clearance that required a standard background investigation. The investigators ran his information through updated databases that cross-referenced Canadian records. The documentation that had been meticulously forged in the 1970s, good enough to pass scrutiny for decades, didn't perfectly align with digitized records that were now being standardized across systems. There were minor discrepancies, inconsistencies in dates and reference numbers, the kind of anomalies that human clerks might have missed or dismissed but that automated systems flagged for review. An investigator made a phone call to Canadian authorities to verify some details. The Canadians couldn't find certain records. More questions were asked. FBI counterintelligence was notified of the anomalies. They began a quiet investigation, initially just trying to determine if this was a case of document fraud or identity theft. They put surveillance on the Johnson house, watched the family's movements, monitored communications. Within 2 months, the pattern of behavior was unmistakable to trained counterintelligence analysts. The late-night trips to the park with unusual regularity. The specific timing of certain movements. The meetings in parking lots that followed tradecraft protocols. By summer 1998, the FBI had classified the case as probable deep-cover foreign intelligence operatives and had begun building a comprehensive investigation. They didn't move immediately. They watched and documented for months, trying to identify the full extent of the network, looking for other operatives, tracking who Michael and Sarah were in contact with. By October, they had accumulated substantial evidence. The decision was made to move forward with arrests. On a Tuesday morning in October 1998, FBI agents executed arrest warrants at the Johnson residence. It was a weekday morning. Michael was working in his home office. Sarah was grading papers at the dining room table. Jennifer was home from Arizona State University for fall break. David, now 17 and a high school senior, was getting ready for school. The FBI knocked on the door at 7:30 in the morning. Michael answered. The agents identified themselves and presented the arrest warrant. Michael and Sarah were handcuffed in their own living room while their children watched in complete confusion. The FBI agent sat Jennifer and David down and explained, as carefully as such a thing can be explained, that their parents were not Canadian immigrants named Michael and Sarah Johnson, but Russian intelligence officers named Mikhail Vasiliev and Svetlana Kozlov who had been living under false identities for 27 years. The names on their birth certificates were fake. The family history they'd been told about grandparents and cousins in Canada was fabricated. The grandparents they'd visited several times during childhood trips weren't actually related to them but were other operatives or support personnel maintaining the cover story. The house they'd grown up in was not just a house but a facility for an intelligence operation. Every family vacation, every holiday gathering, every mundane moment of their childhood had been taking place inside an active espionage mission, and they had been unknowing participants in it. Jennifer immediately became hysterical. David went into shock, sat on the couch staring at nothing, unable to process what he was being told. The FBI agents, who had psychologists on standby for exactly this scenario, tried to emphasize that the children were not under investigation, that they were considered victims, that they had done nothing wrong. But the psychological trauma of discovering that your entire childhood, your entire understanding of your family and your identity, was constructed as cover for a foreign intelligence operation, is not something that can be addressed with reassurances and crisis counseling. It was a fundamental shattering of reality. The legal proceedings that followed were extraordinarily complex, entangled in questions of espionage law, international relations, and the practical difficulties of prosecuting intelligence operations that had operated primarily through ambient information collection rather than traditional theft of classified material. Mikhail and Svetlana, their true names now public, faced federal charges of conspiracy to commit espionage, acting as unregistered agents of a foreign government, fraud, and identity theft. The prosecution had to prove that they had knowingly gathered and transmitted information related to national defense with intent to harm the United States, which was challenging because their operational methods had been so diffuse and long-term, collecting information that was often technically in the public domain but whose aggregation and analysis provided intelligence value. Defense attorneys, appointed because the defendants had no meaningful financial resources beyond their cover identities, argued that by the time of the arrest their clients were effectively inactive, that the collapse of the Soviet Union had rendered their mission obsolete, that they had not transmitted any classified information in years, and that much of what they had collected over the decades was not legally classified material but simply business intelligence. There were geopolitical considerations as well. Russian officials, while not acknowledging the operation, made diplomatic overtures suggesting that prosecution might complicate other areas of US-Russia relations that were already fragile in the post-Soviet environment. After months of legal maneuvering and negotiation, the case was resolved through a plea agreement. Mikhail and Svetlana pled guilty to acting as unregistered foreign agents, a charge that carried significant penalties but avoided the life sentences that espionage convictions would mandate. They were sentenced to time served plus immediate deportation to Russia. In exchange for the plea and their agreement to provide extensive debriefings to U.S. intelligence about historical KGB illegal operations, methods, training, and whatever they knew about other operatives, though by that point their knowledge was years out of date. They were allowed a brief, supervised farewell with Jennifer and David before being transferred to custody for deportation. That meeting, held in a conference room with FBI agents present, lasted 30 minutes. What do you say to children you raised for over 20 years when they've just learned that everything about you was a lie? Mikhail and Svetlana tried to explain that their love for the children was real, that the family moments had been genuine even if the framework was false, but Jennifer and David were too shattered to process it. In March 2000, Mikhail Vasiliev and Svetlana Kozlov were flown to Moscow, two middle-aged people returning to a country they had left as young operatives 3 decades earlier, to a society utterly transformed from the one they remembered, to a nation that no longer particularly valued or honored the type of work they had done. They were debriefed by Russian intelligence, given minimal financial support, and essentially forgotten. Jennifer and David remained in the United States, American citizens by birth who suddenly had to reconstruct their entire sense of identity in the aftermath of a revelation that had destroyed every assumption they'd held about their family and themselves. They were offered counseling and support by the FBI, but the psychological damage was profound and lasting. Jennifer dropped out of Arizona State, changed her name legally to distance herself from the Johnson identity, and moved to a different state where nobody knew her story. She has never spoken publicly about her experience. David finished high school, attended college under his new legal name, and has similarly maintained absolute privacy about his childhood. Both siblings have reportedly had minimal contact with each other in the years since, the shared trauma of their experience making it difficult to maintain a relationship that reminds them constantly of what they went through. The emotional wreckage of growing up as unknowing props in an intelligence operation, of learning that your parents used your existence as cover for espionage activities, of having to question whether any moment of your childhood was genuine or performative, is not something that fades or heals quickly. They were not recruited assets who made choices. They were children whose parents made choices that implicated them without their knowledge or consent. Operation Sagebrush represents a category of intelligence activity that exists in a strange and uncomfortable ethical space that challenges easy categorization. Mikhail and Svetlana did not steal nuclear weapons plans. They did not hack classified computer systems. They did not recruit compromised officials to betray secrets. They lived ordinary lives in an ordinary neighborhood and collected information that was, piece by piece, technically available to anyone patient enough to gather it and knowledgeable enough to understand its significance. Yet their entire existence on American soil was fraudulent, built on forged documents and fabricated identities, and their children were instrumentalized without consent as elements of that fraud. This raises uncomfortable questions that don't have neat answers. Is it espionage when the methods are functionally indistinguishable from normal social interaction and professional networking? What responsibility do intelligence agencies have to the innocent people, like Jennifer and David, whose lives become collateral damage in these multi-decade operations? At what point does the human cost of deep cover programs outweigh whatever intelligence value they generate? These are not abstract philosophical debates happening in academic journals. They are real questions with real consequences for real people whose lives were fundamentally harmed by being caught in the machinery of intelligence operations they never knew existed. And here's the deeply unsettling part that you need to understand. The infrastructure that created Mikhail and Svetlana, that trained them and deployed them and supported them for nearly 30 years, did not disappear when the Soviet Union collapsed. It was reorganized. It was adapted. It continues. The Russian Foreign Intelligence Service still runs deep cover programs. So do other nations. The methodologies have been updated for the digital age, but the core concept remains unchanged. There are illegals operating in Western countries right now, this very moment, living under false identities in suburbs and cities, some with families, some with children who have no idea who their parents actually are or what they're actually doing when they take those unexplained trips or have those private conversations late at night. The family next door with the friendly smiles and the normal jobs and the kids in the same school as yours could be exactly who they appear to be, or they could be something else entirely, and you would have no way to know the difference. The truth that intelligence professionals understand but that the general public tends not to think about is that modern espionage often doesn't look anything like spy movies. It doesn't look like car chases and hidden cameras and dramatic confrontations. It looks like suburbs and carpools and parent-teacher conferences. It looks like patience measured in decades. It looks like ordinary people living ordinary lives while serving extraordinary purposes that remain invisible until the moment they're suddenly, shockingly revealed. It looks like children growing up believing a comprehensive lie because the truth would compromise the operation. And it continues, right now, in ways and places you will never know about until the FBI holds a press conference announcing arrests that will seem to come out of nowhere but that represent investigations that have been running for years. The invisible war never ended. It just learned to look exactly like peace. If you made it this far, it's because you understand something that most people either don't know or actively choose not to think about. The world of intelligence operations is not confined to foreign capitals and embassy backrooms and spy agency headquarters. It's here, woven into the fabric of ordinary American life in ways that are almost impossible to detect until they're exposed. And look, this isn't just a fascinating story from the past that we can file away as history. This is ongoing reality, happening right now in cities and suburbs across America and Europe and anywhere else that nations compete for strategic advantage and geopolitical edge. I created this channel specifically for people like you who refuse to accept the sanitized, comfortable versions of how power actually operates in the modern world. You're going to find stories here that never made it to the evening news, operations that were quietly classified and buried, analysis that goes deeper than the surface-level reporting you get from mainstream sources that don't want to make their audiences uncomfortable. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because every single week I'm bringing you investigations into the real mechanics of international intelligence work, the operations that shaped history and the ones that are shaping our present reality. This is knowledge that fundamentally changes how you see the world around you, how you understand the invisible wars being fought in plain sight by people who look just like your neighbors. Come be part of this community of people who demand more than comfortable illusions and official narratives. Your like genuinely helps this content reach other people who are searching for the same truths you are, who feel that same need to understand what's really happening beneath the surface. Until the next revelation, stay curious, stay questioning, and remember that reality is always stranger and more unsettling than any official story would have you believe.